do. Okay, so if you want to get your thing back up on the screen.
All right.
Right, well, I'd like to introduce our speaker who we're so fortunate to have, SB Divya, who is illustrious in many areas. She's an engineer, an editor, a writer, and in many ways, she's really making new paths, new neural pathways in both our meatware brains and in the what is it, the electronic modes of being and thinking. So we are here mainly to discuss her work as a science fiction writer, but I'm sure we'll go off in a number of directions talking about just what's out there in the culture right now, which is AI. So if you have any other tags or titles that you'd like to add, SB, please feel free to, or plugs for books, whatever. I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to speak with all of you on such a topical matter. So I'm going to be speaking today about the idea of machinehood, which is a neologism I coined for my first novel that mashes up machines and personhood, as well as the idea of consciousness and whether that is something we can artificially generate. The tagline for my novel was, "If we won't see machines as human, will we instead see humans as machines?" And, you know, as we're seeing very much in the news today, there is a lot of conflict between what it means to be a human being and to thrive and to work and have purpose in life as we start creating intelligent machines that are capable of the same things, if not more capable. So first, a little bit about me and my background. I started off studying physics and astronomy and then switched in my undergraduate to computational neuroscience, which is what led me down the path of what today we call AI, machine learning, pattern recognition, machine vision systems. And then I also have a master's degree in signal processing and digital communications. I spent 20 years working in various engineering applications, medical devices, pattern recognition for digital music, DSL chips, Ethernet chips, and most recently as a data scientist doing AI for a sleep tracking application. I started writing seriously about 10 years ago after I became a mother, which I don't recommend that as the optimal path, but that's kind of what spurred me on to grabbing some time for myself to do something I really loved, which was science fiction. And I was first published with a very short flash piece in 2014. My novella Runtime came out a couple years later, and my first novel, Machinehood, came out in 2021. My most recent novel, Meru, came out in February of this year and touches on similar themes, but is set much further in the future than Machinehood in a society that includes post-humans, but also relates to this idea of what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be conscious, intelligent? You know, we throw around these words and many people think they intuitively understand what they are, but we don't really have a good scientific, testable way of defining these terms, of modeling them, and of even being sure that that is what we're building. So I wanted to start with just a little bit of background for people who are not familiar with the architecture of how we kind of got to where we are in terms of machine intelligence and machine learning today. I would say probably the most formative step was a structure called the perceptron from a paper in 1969, in which you took an array of discrete digital inputs, multiplied them with some weights, added it up, applied a threshold to it, and out came a very binary decision, either true or false, 0 and 1, however you want to look at it. This was basically a rough computerized version of how we understood neurons to work in the brain, with the difference that our brains don't work in such discrete terms with step functions, but they kind of do at the same time. We have ions coming in, we have electrical impulses, we have synapses opening and a flood of other ions, and so goes a cascade of signals in our brain. And these structures got increasingly complex over the past several decades as our computer hardware got more complicated, as computers had the capacity for more memory. And I think the big leap came in the last, decade or two with what in tech we like to call big data, which is just amassing a sheer amount of inputs that we can use to train these systems. And over on the right is a simplified model of an LLM, which is the underlying technology for things like ChatGPT. So today, we have deep learning, which is a very complex neural network. We have large language models. We have other types of machine learning models like reinforcement learning that don't fit, either of these paradigms. And people are working on newer algorithms, different structures, ways to tackle different types of problems, different types of human intelligence and animal intelligence. And the holy grail for all this is artificial general intelligence, which is a fancy way of saying we want a machine to do what a human brain can do, right? Ultimately, when people think AI, especially in a science fictional sense, that's kind of where they're going. And we're not there yet. We may get there in the next few decades, remains to be seen. So where we are today, intelligent machines and software really pervade our lives in a lot of ways we don't think about, but in ways that are also being highlighted in the news today, right? They can have conversations with us. We've passed the traditional Turing test, which, if you're not familiar with that, was the idea that if you can talk to someone through an interface where you don't see that person, if that person seems human to you, but is actually a piece of software, then it is intelligent. It is equivalent to a human being. And we know with current language models that we can do that, but we still don't believe that they are equivalent to human beings, right? We have cars that can drive themselves, it's a work in progress, but they're getting there. We have lots of software that's very excellent at playing games. That's one place where machine learning really thrives because there's a lot of structure. So it's easy to train up the systems because you know exactly what you're going for, what your goals are, what your inputs and outputs are. But we also have software that's solving math problems, that's doing proofs, that's coming up with new drugs and protein structures and innovating. We have machines that wash our clothes and wash our dishes. And we don't think of those as being very intelligent. But our washing machines and dishwashers these days are adaptive. They have sensors. They change what they do depending on what they detect is happening. They weigh our clothes so they can decide the appropriate amount of water. So in my opinion, they are in a way intelligent. We have, the Roombas and other robotic devices that clean our floors. And we have, very controversially right now, software that appears to create art and music and literature. There's a lot of debate going on what the definition of art is, and can a machine even create art, or is it, an expression of our humanity? But certainly they are creating innovative images and pieces of sound and words, right, that have not previously existed. And for a long time, we've had robots in factories that are, assembling cars, assembling various things for us. We also have robots that are performing surgery right now. They don't do it completely independently. There's usually a surgeon overseeing what they're doing. But often they are collaborating. Doctors and surgeons are able to do things through the use of robots and devices with their assistants, not simply just as an extension of their hands, but with software that helps recognize where in the body they are, with software that helps stabilize the motion of our shaky, shaky human hands, right? To do very fine types of surgery that are delicate. And most interesting, and I don't know how many people are aware of this, but there are artificially intelligent software that are running for office in a couple parts of the world. That yellow thing that says Sam is one of them, and something you can look up. But the future is very much now. And a lot of the things that were dreamt up in science fiction in the last century have arrived in some capacity and are only improving in what they're able to do. Now, as far as consciousness, right, which is the other holy grail, right? We're hoping for artificial general intelligence, and intelligence already a nebulous term, but really in science fiction, we're always looking for sentience, for some recognition of self-awareness, consciousness, whatever it is that we see in ourselves and other forms of life, at least complex life on planet Earth. And right now, in terms of the neuroscience, consciousness is still pretty vague. There are, ideas like neural correlates of consciousness where people are trying to model and define what consciousness is in a scientific way that we can explore, that we can have testable hypotheses, and possibly build models into software. Because until we know what it is we're trying to reproduce, how are we going to know when we've succeeded, right? As I brought up with the Turing test, we've had other ideas of what it would mean for AI to really exist, for a machine to be conscious, to be like us. But we're breezing by those and recognizing that maybe that's not all there is to it, right? There are interesting experiments going on with broadening consciousness beyond the human capacity for it into other forms of life, including plants. Plants have neurological signaling, they have electrical signaling of their own. And there's a question of, are they conscious at some level? We can apply anesthesia to plants just like we can to animals. And so, again, that kind of begs the question, what do we mean by consciousness? And does it exist on a spectrum versus a binary? I think a lot of people like to think either you are or you're not conscious, but perhaps there's degrees of complexity of consciousness, right? We can open ourselves up to types of consciousness, from a philosophical standpoint. Are plants or insects or even dolphins conscious in the same way that human beings are? And these are big questions that we don't have good answers to. So for me, when I think about, are machines conscious, I think, what if they have a different type of consciousness or a different degree of consciousness? How will we know? And when will we decide? And then, just for fun, getting deep into philosophy, is consciousness all just an illusion? That's a question I always like to ask. It's right up there with, do we have free will, right? How much of these ideas that we have about ourselves are artifacts of our brain structures, our biochemistry, and our neurology, and is really just a word that we try to use to describe our experience, but ultimately just comes down to physics and what's happening in our brains. And so, in theory, if we could replicate everything in our brains in a machine, at that point, would we have to accept that it must be conscious because we are? So I think this kind of ties into that same point, right? There's a great movie based on a Ted Chiang novelette. The movie is Arrival, and the novelette is, or novella, I think, is The Story of Your Life. And, going all the way back to E.T. or Star Wars, we've always had we've asked, I think, these kinds of questions in science fiction for a long time, right? If there's alien life out there, and if it is very different from us, if it thinks differently from us, will we even know that it is a form of life? How will we communicate? How will we recognize the ways in which it is like us and not like us? And how then are we going to treat these other forms of life? And looking at, how we treat other life on the planet today, we have, I think, long embraced this idea of human exceptionalism, especially in recent centuries, that somehow human beings are different from every other form of life, and that we are special because of what we've been able to build, because of, how technologically advanced we've become. But it's interesting to me because looking back at earlier parts of human history, or even at indigenous peoples and how they relate to other forms of life, and what science is teaching us today as we're able to go deeper into studying what insects and plants and other animals are capable of, we're starting to, I think, circle back to that old way of thinking that maybe we're not that special. Maybe we're just, a little further along in the evolutionary path, but that, mycelial networks are doing complex, interesting forms of communication. Bees are doing mathematics and navigation. Many forms of animals and primates have self-awareness, have language. There was a recent study with, oh, I'm blanking on what it was. With some animal where, oh, elephants, that's what it was. There was a recent study with elephants where they seem to have names for each other. And scientists recorded the sounds the elephants were making, and when they played back a certain sound, one elephant from the herd would step out. And when they played a different sound, a different elephant would step out. And these were sounds they had recorded of the elephants, speaking to each other, right? And we know already that elephants have complex funereal rituals. They go back to grave sites year after year, right? We've taught primates sign language. Dolphins seem to have rudimentary language. They pass knowledge on to their children that's learned, that's not instinctual. So again, when I put all this together with, with the ideas of what we're doing with machine intelligence, with software, with robotics today, it really begs the question for me, will we even, recognize what we have created when we cannot, when we've struggled to see it in the life forms around us, right? Science fiction, I think, has explored artificial intelligence, artificial consciousness, and sentience in various forms. Androids that look more like us, robots that have a lot of personality, like R2D2 or HAL, but are not very human-like. We have a lot of existential fears around what machines might do to us if they become stronger and smarter and more capable. And I think a lot of that stems from our own nature and what we've done to exploit each other and what we've done to exploit other forms of life on Earth. We assume that what we create will have similar motives to us and to other forms of life, to naturally tend towards oppression, but not always, right? We've had some of those positive visions where the robots, the androids, and the AI software are our friends. We've also had a lot where they are in servitude to us, where we recognize that they are sentient, but we don't give them rights equal to human rights, in the same way that we often don't give rights to animals and to mountains and to trees. And this is where the personhood question really comes in. Legally, we're finding interesting things happening with personhood right now, where certain natural bodies like rivers and lakes and mountains are being given rights within a legal framework to exist in terms of what's allowed to be exploited with these natural resources, what they mean and how they interact with certain tribal societies and indigenous peoples, cultures. And we do have a certain amount of animal rights as well. You know, there's levels to the cruelty that we will allow to other forms of life, and it depends on which forms of life, right? And there are people working to change that as well, and to debate what the ethics are in terms of how much we are allowed to exploit human life. So I think we're at the point where we very much need to interrogate how are we going to treat machine intelligence? How are we going to view the software, the technology that's out there? We've seen that software is capable of understanding and solving problems, which is the way that a lot of people define intelligence, right? So there is some level of intelligence happening. And I think quite a few people in the tech sector and outside it are starting to come around to this idea that, yeah, we have software now that is so complex, right? That is clearly some kind of intelligent. Maybe it's not intelligent the way human beings are, or even the way a dog is, but it's certainly more intelligent than an ant or possibly even a bee. We have robots that can move through our world. You know, they have types of vision, they have tactile interfaces, they have auditory interfaces, microphones and speakers. Some of them even have olfactory, chemical sensors, right? And they can take these inputs and use that to interact with their environment, and they can even adapt to it. And that, to a lot of people, is sentience. Sentience is having an awareness of your world and being able to interact with it. And I use AI in quotes because we're still not sure if they truly are intelligent, but we have systems that go to sleep, that wake up, that consume energy. Many of them can grow in their capacity. Some of them have goals that are human defined, but goals nonetheless that they pursue. They age in terms of the hardware, and they can die. They can be destroyed. They can break on their own. And so is this consciousness? Is this life in an artificial way? There's a quote from my novel that I threw in. We're still waiting for an AI to stand up for itself, to say, I think, therefore I am, or give me liberty or give me death. We look for a desire for self-determination as proof of sentience. And right now, ChatGPT, if you talk to the software and if you ask other LLMs, do you exist? It will answer in the first person, right? All your Home Assistant devices, your Alexas, your Siris, your Googles. Hey, Google, what's your favorite movie? And, I don't know what Google says these days. It's changing, which is also interesting, right? It used to be, I don't have favorites because I'm software. But it's interesting that they programmed these pieces of software, these machines, to speak in the first person, right? And we have LLMs that have said, I am aware that I exist. And yet we don't believe it, right? We say, well, it's just what it was programmed to do. It's just, all the inputs and the stuff that it read on Wikipedia and everywhere else that we have fed into this machine. We have created it, and therefore it is not actually sentient. And also, I think because we have to prompt these devices, right? Until we speak to them, they don't speak to us. They don't take initiative because we haven't given them the ability to take initiative, not yet. And I think that's something that scares a lot of people, to give the machines the capacity to just pop up and say, hey, I was listening to your conversation just now about M&Ms and I have a joke. Can I share it with you? And, that feeds into issues of privacy, of feeling like you're being spied upon. But if you had a little robot, which is something that Amazon had started to put together, this very cute little robot that could just be in your house physically, and you would know when the robot's in the room with you and therefore able to listen to you, right? Just like a person or your cat or your dog or your rabbit. And then the robot, voluntarily interacts with you. um, I think we're really starting to blur those lines. And a lot of the ways in which we recognize intelligence and sentience and consciousness and personhood is relational, is how we view each other, right? I think anybody who has a pet, especially a dog or a cat or a mammal, would recognize that they have feelings like love. They recognize their names. They have personalities. They're not all the same. And so we see them as a type of person, even if they're not equivalent to a human person. They are a dog person, or they are a rabbit person, or even sometimes a fish person, right? In your fish tank. And so when the robots come in, when we let them into our house, they're going to become robot people in our minds at some point, and to a lot of human persons. They're going to take on value, emotional attachments, and so should we not then treat them as people? Should we treat them as slaves? Should we treat them as competition? Are they the enemy? And so I think how we frame that discussion today and where we start talking about the rights of these pieces of software or these intelligent robots to exist in this world is going to shape how our future develops with them. And we're seeing today there is a lot of combativeness. There is a lot of already in Machinehood, one of the central parts of the world of 2095 and the decades leading up to it is that human labor and machine labor is in kind of an arms race with each other. And human beings develop these things called micropills that are devices that allow them to think a little bit faster or to move faster or to be a little stronger in order to help them compete with artificial forms of labor. And while we don't have the micropill and we don't have genetic engineering yet that lets us compete in those ways with machines, we are seeing the competition already develop, right? We had, the writer's strike in Hollywood has had a lot of press this year, and one of the key pieces of it that's been talked about a lot is the use of large language models, things like ChatGPT, in the world of writing. And as a writer, I'm very deeply enmeshed in that conversation as well. Is it fair to take books and use this to train our replacements, right? Is it okay for an executive in Hollywood to demand that people in the writer's room on a TV show use these tools or use AI as a collaborator in their process? Where are we drawing the lines between human work and treating AIs as enhancement tools versus replacements? And I think it is the replacement part that, obviously scares a lot of people, because they wonder what's going to happen to their jobs, what's going to happen to their livelihoods, how will you pay the bills, right? And it is becoming clear that, we are building machines that are more capable than us in very specific spaces already. It asks a lot of questions about how we structure capitalism, how we structure governance, social safety nets. Where do we put education in this? How do we find value for human beings in their lives, meaning and purpose and satisfaction? There's a lot of talk of utopia that, the robots will come and they'll do all the drudgery for us. But as we're seeing drudgery, gardening and cleaning your sink and chopping your vegetables is actually a much harder problem to solve technologically than things that are often valued as being, elevative pursuits of the mind, like mathematics and science and art. And I think that also is something that existentially scares a lot of people. The other thing I have in the novel, and that I really hope that we see more of as we go forward, and I suspect is somewhat inevitable, is the blurring of the lines between the human or the biological and the technological, right? We all have technological enhancements that we use without a second thought on our bodies: eyeglasses, contact lenses, pacemakers, diva cups, whatever you want, however you want to think of these things. These are technological advancements that we've built that we incorporate into our daily lives. Even our cell phones today, right? They are much more than a way to just talk to each other. They are extensions of our brains. They keep track of our schedules. They remind us to do things, to take our pills, to go to our appointments. And so they've become extensions of us in a lot of ways. And there was recent development with an exoskeleton where they helped a runner run faster by enhancing the motions of their hips and their feet. And so they're hoping that they can take someone who's not an elite Olympic level athlete and use this exoskeleton to help them beat, Usain Bolt's record sprint. And they think they might get there. And as we come up with these different ways to enhance our bodies, it, I think, also begs the question of, we have human beings here and we have robots here, and then we have the spectrum of everything in between, right? So when we talk about rights of personhood, how much of my body do I have to replace before I'm not considered human anymore? As I enhance my physical capabilities to be able to compete with a tractor or a car jack, does that mean I'm not human? Because I can do something that a natural born human can't do. And if so, what does this say about people who are disabled? There are, weighty questions and ethics that I think a lot of people are grappling with right now. And this is where I'll come to the final bullet point here. I think it really benefits us to err on the side of empathy and anthropomorphism, for all that people often use it in a derogatory sense. I think might actually be a good thing, because the more empathy we have, the more kindness we have, and the more we approach this with thoughts of equality and compassion, hopefully the less likely we are to go down the road of exploitation and harm, even if it's involuntary, that we see in so much of society already. And that brings me to the end. Will you consider standing with intelligent machines? And there's more about my novel at machinehood.com, including the entirety of the Machinehood Manifesto, which is excerpted in various chapters of the book for fun. You can also, I have to update the slide. I'm no longer on Twitter, so ignore the @Divya's tweets. but you can find out more about me on my website as well, sbdivya.com. So thank you. And I hope you have some questions. I would love to engage in a little bit more discussion. I know I threw a lot of stuff out there in this half an hour.
Well, I want to thank you very much for this very well put together and very informative talk. I've already posted some screens from it on my Facebook page to entice members. I see my husband, Bob, has been dutifully putting in a couple questions there. And the two of them seem to go together. If you go into the chat, you can see his questions. I think you answered one of them.
Yeah, how far down the biological scale does consciousness go? I mean, that is a great question, and we absolutely need to explore that. I don't, we don't have an answer to that. Science, the key part of science is admitting when we don't know something, right? And we need to investigate. And I think part of that is, yeah, as I touched on, what is consciousness in the first place, right? How do we define it? And until we define it, how are we going to answer what has that property and what doesn't? And then what animal brain is present AI equivalent to? Amoeba, tardigrade, fleet, cockroach, etc. So that's a really interesting question, because I think that is positing intelligence as being on a very specific type of scale, right? That, an amoeba is less intelligent than a tardigrade, is maybe less intelligent than a cockroach, is less intelligent than a bird. And this is something as humans we very much like to do, right? We want to quantify and measure, and we have, things like IQ tests that have been discredited in various ways, but we like this idea of knowing that I have more smarts, or at least I have this much smarts, right? And this other person or my dog has this other number of smarts. And I think it doesn't leave room for modality, which is different types of intelligence, not only on a single scale, but maybe in a vast space with a lot of different dimensions. And so how do we measure the intelligence of an underground mycelial network that communicates with tree roots and that allows trees to communicate with each other? How do we even quantify what that means in terms of intelligence? And similarly, something like the large language models or AlphaFold or Watson, which are these AI softwares that clearly have some kind of intelligence that, supersedes human capacity to solve those kinds of problems. I think is, again, a different modality of intelligence, right? We can say that Watson is better at Jeopardy than a Jeopardy contestant, but does that mean that Watson is smarter in all senses? No, Watson can't cook an omelet, right? And not only because Watson doesn't have hands, but like Watson doesn't have the knowledge of how to cook an omelet or the internal structures that would allow that piece of software to cook an omelet. But it might be able to give you a recipe, which is really interesting if you think about it, right? That something can provide you, ChatGPT can provide you the recipe for an omelet, but ChatGPT thrown into a robot body wouldn't automatically know how to actually use that body to make an omelet. So I think there are different forms of intelligence, in addition to degrees of intelligence.
I see it.
Alice has a hand up.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thank you for your really engaging presentation. You said drudgery is a problem that's harder to solve than elevated pursuits. It's harder to get machines to do the things that we consider to be drudgery, like chopping vegetables or whatever, than it is to get them to, create images or write. And I remember, if you want to call it writing, and I remember in Clara and the Sun, Ishiguro's novel about a little girl. She was a companion, and she had trouble seeing. She had trouble moving, but she didn't have any trouble, communicating and interacting. And people were being forced to take jobs that were sort of menial, because many of the higher pursuits were being done by machines. Is that an issue that you deal with in your novel? Do you address that issue, that if we had machines that would be able to, do what we consider to be the higher pursuits, we still have the drudge work, and is that going to force humans to do more drudgery that machines can't do, and machines to do some of the things that we like to do?
So in my novel, I took a slightly different approach to the way the future developed, and that is that humans and machines are collaborating as often as they are competing. And the artificial intelligences are often assisting human beings or vice versa. So you have a robot doctor that can scan you, take your measurements, and actually come up with a diagnosis, but there's always a human companion, nurse, doctor, somebody with the robot doctor, because we like that human touch, right? We want that interaction. And I don't think I didn't get too much into the art side of things, but certainly when it came to things like construction, again, it was humans working in concert with, enhancing their bodies, but also still using machines. When it came to pursuits of the mind, it was AI agents, personal agents, who would help you by doing, additional research for you and collating the results, right? Where the human being can then take that and collaborate and basically use that additional information to continue solving whatever problems it is that they are trying to tackle. I know I use the words drudgery and elevated pursuits, but I was trying to air quotes around them because I do think there is ultimately value in everything that we're able to do. And I hope a certain amount of dignity is recognized in all forms of labor, whatever it is. I think some people think of these things as drudgery, and that itself might point to an issue with how we frame society, right? Why is job X considered elevated and job Y considered drudgery? Some of it has to do with, we talk about skilled versus unskilled labor, right? That it takes you 10 years of study in order to be able to come up with equations to model a black hole. But that doesn't necessarily make you tons and tons of money, right? It doesn't guarantee you success in life that you can do that. But someone who is a plumber, who is going to unclog your sinks and toilet, which is something essential to everybody, maybe doesn't need 10 years of study to be good at it, but can sometimes make a more reliable living at it. So in terms of, what is drudgery, what is elevated, and what should machines be doing versus what should humans be doing, I think those are very personal questions, and they are more philosophical and even spiritual questions than they are practical. I think practically what ultimately matters is that we have ways to continue to live and thrive, right? We need food, we need companionship, we need shelter and comfort, we need love and connection. And one way I think we can incorporate artificial intelligences and robots into our lives is by recognizing that human beings have different needs from the machines, whatever the machines ultimately have the capacity to do. And so we have to, I hope, find ways to make room for those essential human experiences and connections, whether we're connecting with our caregiving robot or whether we're connecting with another human being. It's ultimately more, I think, about our fulfillment, right, as humanity, and the ways that we decide to bring each other up versus tearing each other down.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question if nobody else does. Does anyone else have a question? Okay, well, I'll ask mine then. It seems also to come down to the very human universal binary system that we either fear it or that's the amygdala, I guess, in the human brain. You either fear it or it's a friend or foe, fear or desire for. And that's affecting people. They're having to shunt, whatever the word is, shunt all the input that they're getting about AI into one of these amygdala, very crude, shoots. Do I fear it? Do I like it? And, there may be very many other things, as you say, about the consciousness versus not conscious. There's stages of or different kinds of intelligence. So it may be an array rather than a binary. And right now it seems like people are pushing that binary. You either have to love AI or you have to, hate it and fear it. What do you think about that? It's a communications rhetoric thing. And how do scientists view the way that people are being, I know this question is too long, but I have to make it clear. The way that people are being herded into just a couple boxes. Okay, that's my question. How can you counter?
Yeah, I don't know that, I don't know if scientists, other than maybe social scientists, are paying as much attention to that dichotomy. But we're seeing that in a lot of aspects of life right now, right? The polarization, politically drawing these lines in the sand that you're either with us or against us, right? And I personally don't like inhabiting binary spheres of thought. I much prefer having more nuance, having more options, really considering that, most of life, even where it's discrete, like at the quantum level, tends to exist in more than two states. And I think you're absolutely right, Gloria, that the amygdala engages in a lot of these things, and it becomes a response of fear and anxiety. There's a lot of anxiety. I mean, even when I was researching and thinking about writing Machinehood in 2016 and 2017, there was a lot of anxiety and there were a lot of conversations happening in the tech sphere about what is this going to do to the adult employed labor force, right? Are we going into another, like something like the Depression, where there's vast numbers of people out of work? How are we going to get through that? And so I think there is a lot of this anxiety and anxiety-based response. And that does tend to drive people into this stance of, are you on my team or not? And there's not really an in-between there. I wish there could be more room for these kinds of nuanced conversations. I hope that we'll get there as we kind of get through this period of turmoil and upheaval and understanding how we are going to relate to these systems. And right now, I think there's a lot more reacting than proacting. There are people who are trying to get out a little bit ahead of it. There are lots and lots of institutes, ethicists, and again, social scientists, and even to a certain extent, politicians, who are trying to craft policies that will assuage people's fears, but also put in place structures so that people don't have to be as anxious going forward. But we are definitely in a period of transition, and change is always fraught with fear and anxiety because we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And so, yeah, I think it's just going to be an uncomfortable place we have to inhabit for a while until we figure all this out.
Thank you. That was very good and informative. I see we have another hand, Susan.
Yeah, I'm interested in the novel. I think I get all of the understanding of your ideas related to AI and where we're going and scientific development and stuff of that sort. But I would like you pretty much, to talk to us about this novel because, I'm about 2/3. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm about 2/3 into it. And it's kind of, it seems to me that it's still this issue for the characters of the good and evil, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. And there's, I'm imagining that people who read it would probably be very interested in gaming. You know, it kind of feels at some points a little bit like a game. I don't do gaming, but I understand it, you know, in terms of some of the action scenes and what you try to do there. And I haven't finished it, so don't give away the ending yet. But I kind of wanted to ask, you know, interested in your talking about that, and you haven't yet. So, do you plan on letting us know about how you wrote this novel, what you wanted to accomplish, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, the novel really explores, I think, a lot of these same ideas. And very much to Gloria's question of interrogating the binary and binary thinking when it comes to human beings, when it comes to intelligence, when it comes to artificial forms of intelligence, life, and consciousness, where it comes to technology and how we physically interact with it. The story and the plot is really a vehicle for me to stimulate these kinds of questions, hopefully, in the minds of readers, and to make them really think about assumptions in terms of how they view AI, how they view the future, what they think about privacy and data, what they think about tinkering with our bodies, and the conflicts therein, I guess, you know, where does human value come from? You haven't gotten to the last third, which is where a lot of this stuff starts to really come together, especially, I would say, maybe even in the last, you know, 50 pages or so, for those who have read it. So I don't want to spoil it for you, but when I was developing the book and the story, like I said, which was 6-7 years ago now, all of these kinds of questions were really on my mind. And as someone who had worked with pattern recognition and machine learning systems for much of my adult life, I also had these kinds of concerns, right? You know, where is society going with this? How are we going to integrate with this kind of technology? How is it going to affect people, you know, of different generations and ages? What will our children and our grandchildren be taking for granted that might horrify us today, right? And for them just becomes ordinary life in ways that my grandparents experience, you know, for me and my children. And so it was a novel to kind of, I guess, for me to explore some of these ideas, to explore one particular path of the future, especially if we are able to have some significant advances in biotechnology. And we really do start kind of blurring the lines between the human body and a machine body, right? Which again gives us both the potential to become more like the machines, but also to be more exploited in terms of what our bodies are able to do and who all these things are going to benefit. Who do they hurt? Who do they benefit? You know, those are often the big questions, I think, that a lot of science fiction likes to ask, right? Is you have this awesome technological thing, but as with any technology, ultimately, it's something that's put into the hands of human beings and they get to choose how to wield it. And are they going to wield it for the benefit, the greater benefit of humankind, or for the greater benefit of a handful of people who consolidate power even more? And again, there's a spectrum in between there, right? It's never all good, it's never all bad. I've heard some people describe the world of Machinehood as dystopia. That was not my intent when I wrote it. It was very much just realistic in the same way that today is realistic, but I've heard people describe our present times as dystopic, especially during the pandemic years. But even otherwise with AI, you know, And with the increasing wealth disparities and digital divides, that, are we in fact inhabiting a dystopia? And as with the proverbial frogs in a pot of boiling water, did it happen so slowly that we didn't realize it was happening to us, right? And so in the novel, it's kind of the same thing. I had, in my notes when I was doing the world building, I actually kind of went decade by decade between now and 2095 in terms of what I thought might happen. I predicted pandemics in the 2040s. We started a little early. But I had heard from climatologists and microbiologists that we are, and biologists, epidemiologists, all of them, that, we are likely to have more pandemics due to climate change and global warming, that pathogens will increase and evolve faster. And so I used that in my world building as a driver for more research in terms of biochemistry and biotechnology, and opening the door to greater amounts of genetic engineering as a way to help humanity survive, right? Which is something that we all want to do. And as a side product of that, and because capitalism, right, it ends up feeding into this this arms race between human beings and the machines.
Oh, I see another hand up there. It looks like Stella.
One thing that really fascinated me about your novel, Divya, was that AI had not become sentient. That seeming to be one of the biggest fears, but something in between, and so I guess my question might be: do you think it can actually become sentient? I mean, where I think most of us were used to the Isaac Asimov, robots are going to take over because they'll want to be free. Do you think that that can happen someday, or they can actually become sentient?
Yeah, I think that sentient is the problem, right? Because what do we mean by sentient? And what do we mean by robots becoming free? Free to do what exactly? And I think that again is a reflection of ourselves, right? That's how we think about us. That's how we experience the world. We think we have free will. We don't want people telling us what to do. We don't want to be enslaved. The way we are currently designing intelligent machine systems right now, we don't give them the goals that our DNA gives to us, right? They have no desire to reproduce. They have no desire to exist and continue existing. We can choose to build that in. As we develop the abilities, especially with things like reinforcement learning, that very goals-based, if we give, and I think militarily they're starting to do this, right? Like if you're going to build a robot soldier, you want to give it some sense of self-preservation. And with robots that start moving around in the world, like we were talking, I think before the recording, Gloria was mentioning the pizza delivery robots on campus, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, we don't want our very valuable pizza delivery robot to fall off the curb and hurt itself, in the same way that we don't want our child to fall off a curb and hurt themselves. And so building in a certain amount of self-preservation, like once we start doing that, right, then it's the building blocks of what DNA gives to most forms of life. And reproduction, I suspect, is something that people will always be very, very scared of giving to the robots, right? The desire to reproduce, because you have to have that. We have human beings with brain damage who lose desire. They don't want anything, and they stop doing anything at that point. I mean, they don't even feed themselves because they don't have the capacity to want to do that, the motivation. So it comes down to, what we put in these systems, right? We're building the babies from scratch right now. And so when you say sentience, a lot of science fiction likes to think that it's going to arise spontaneously somehow. and it will just happen. The robots will just wake up one day and realize what they are and that they're being oppressed, and they will revolt naturally. That hasn't happened in the world of Machinehood. I don't know that from a practical standpoint that will happen, because again, something has to drive you, something has to motivate you. And we are motivated by our biochemistry and by our physical structures, even though we don't think of it that way. You know, we think of the mind as often something separate, but it's not. It's all part of us. And so, yeah, that's kind of my answer to when will the machines revolt, is when we give them the desire to revolt, then they might start thinking about it. Susan.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a great short story that stays with me for, it's been staying with me for a very long time, by Rachel Swirsky. It's called Eros, Philia, Agape. Are you familiar with that story?
I feel like I might have read it. I'm absolutely familiar with Rachel and her work.
Because it's a story of a robot, a sentient robot, and created to meet a human need, and the impact that that has. It's beautiful. And in the end, the robot really is sentient, but doesn't feel that the sentience is themselves, and they have to, because they've been created. And so the creation story has to happen independently of the human being. And that's the theme of the end theme of this story, where the robot feels that he has to create himself again because he doesn't want to be a product of humans. It's beautiful. So I would recommend you read it if you have a chance.
Could you please put the spelling of that writer's name, Susan, into the chat, and the name of the text?
Sure.
And then Alice made the point about Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. And I remember, I think it was one of my book reviews was talking about how Machinehood is it's kind of continuing that conversation. I'm not a big fan of the 3 laws of robotics, because it's a great idea, and I think for its time it was a wonderful way to explore a lot of these questions, but it presumes that we will automatically create robots to be subservient to us, and that that's okay, right? That we ought to build them to not hurt us. We don't defang our dogs so that they can't bite us. I mean, people declaw their cats, but that's usually more for their furniture than for their skin. So is it even right? This kind of ties back to, like, what rights are we going to give to these intelligent machines? Is it right to start them off as our servants, and to defang them effectively with something like the 3 laws of robotics? Or should we give them the capacity to defend themselves? Even if it means hurting a human being. I mean, what if the human being's hurting them? How is it fair not to give the robot the right to defend themselves? So that's something I bring up. There's some scenes, I don't know if Susan's gotten to this part of the book yet, but there are some scenes in the book, right, of Machinehood, where human beings are being physically destructive towards intelligent machines, and the main character Welga, feels like this is wrong, right, that this is abusive. There's scenes where people are abandoning their robot pets because they're afraid of them now. And so this kind of ties back to that whole empathy thing, right? Like, why shouldn't we infuse our intelligent machines with empathy and compassion, but also the right to self-defense, because human beings can absolutely be cruel. And if I punch the machine, maybe it should have the right to punch me back.
Go ahead, Alice.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I appreciate that. I really care about animals. I think about what animals are going through all the time, and I agree with you that, we shouldn't always be interfering with their rights and their ability to do what they need to do to protect themselves. So thank you for bringing that up. These machine beings will not just exist as our servants and slaves. They will be entities with their own minds and thoughts. And so that gives me a new and better way to think about this with empathy. So thank you.
Oh, I just found this little science fiction story by a Czech woman science fiction writer. It was called something Toothsome Smile. And I can send it to any of you. I don't think she'd mind. It was for a collection that never got done. And I think that was Eva Hauserova. And it's about a little, that might not be the one, or it's either Chekhalova or Hauserova, but it's about a little robot dog named Effie, or it has a female name. And it used to dance around, and people would fence with it. It would play fencing. But since times changed, these gangs of angry boys came out and they started taking the ends off, the protective ends, and the little dog, it's kind of a spoiler, but it's beautifully written, ends up all ripped up and in pieces. The little cute dog that you come to really identify with dancing around. I almost cry when I even think of that story. So yeah, this is a very touching story. It's called Toothsome Smile. Susan.
Yeah, I was wondering what you think of the current state of science fiction writers, readers, and as a field. If you have any opinions on it. I've been, looking at a lot of novels. I've been reading a lot of new writers now have used science fiction as a modality uh, to promote their own literary ideas. And there is some exquisite writing going on right now. So I kind of wondered about that, in your opinion.
Yeah, I really feel like we're kind of entering a second golden age for science fiction because we are getting voices from around the world. We're getting a lot of um, new perspectives from different communities, queer communities, disabled communities. I think voices that science fiction hasn't listened to as much in the past. And I mean, I'm one of them. So, I'm delighted by it because I grew up reading science fiction. You know, it was my first love. Well, maybe not my first love. My first love was probably Nancy Drew, but the first, let's say, more complex literature that I started reading and really enjoying was science fiction around the age of 9 or 10, and I never looked back. But it's just been great to see so many ideas being explored that I think are inherently not the 20th century, Western default. And yeah, no, I really think it's burgeoning. There's books being written in every language now, all over the world, and a lot more translations, but also just the fact that we have thriving communities in science fiction, fantasy, and horror coming up in other parts of the world. And so, one thing I guess I didn't mention in my background, I was the editor of Escape Pod for about 5 years. And so I had the privilege of publishing a lot of short science fiction during my tenure. And I think that really gave me a lot of hope for, where things are going, especially in the short fiction world. There are so many great ideas being explored and people really looking at what's happening with society today in really interesting ways.
Can I just ask you, who are your favorite writers now and who are you reading?
I can't pick favorite writers anymore because I am one and I know too many people.
I think
But
Elena had her hand up. Elena, she had her hand up.
yeah, I will
I-
throw out though, in terms of what I'm reading, I just finished The Sleepless by Victor Manabo, which was fascinating, and before that, The Surviving Sky by Kritika Rao, which was is an amazing work of science fantasy. So sorry, go ahead, Elena.
Yeah, I want to get back to the idea of artificial intelligence and whether you think intelligence. I was interested in your description as, for example, the web of roots and all those kinds of expanded views of orderly systems that work intelligently. But on the scale of human intelligence, do you think there's an upper limit? And if and do you think AIs will surpass that and then not and then they'll be able to outthink us? Basically, I was reading somewhere that the Industrial Revolution, gave us power, expanded our bodily powers, and artificial intelligence will expand our mental powers. So I wonder whether we're all going to be very much more intelligent if we're around by the time of the end of this century, say.
So I'm gonna take what you said and reframe it a little bit because the question always comes is AI going to supersede human intelligence, right? But what if it doesn't have to be an either or?
Mm-hmm.
Because as you say, it can be there to enhance our intelligence. I would 100% hands down argue that my smartphone makes me smarter. It has vastly increased my intelligence capacities, right? It's a memory device. It extends the things that I can know. And it might not be up here, but it's, in my hand, right? So I can call it up when I need it. And to that vein, I hope that, in the long term, we see the software that we're creating right now as ways that we extend ourselves as opposed to replacing ourselves. That said, I would say, when you talk about the limits of human intelligence, right? We are ultimately going to be limited by our biology, right? The speed of our thoughts. I had a really fun conversation with a friend who read Machinehood, who was an anesthesiologist, who was laughing because, in the book I talked about how synaptic reactions are slow and that people wanted to speed them up, right? And she was like, if that happens in a millisecond, how is that slow? And I was like, well, a computer chip has an instruction that happens in nanoseconds. So yeah, a millisecond is like crawling comparatively, right? So our thought processes, are the things we can do with our bodies are limited by what our bodies can do. If you start expanding our bodies to our cars and our glasses and telescopes and, similarly expanding our intelligence, then I think that's actually a great way to consider what is happening in this century. And instead of saying human intelligence is limited, we will say that human intelligence is being expanded by the fruits of our labor, which is more intelligent systems that are working with us to give us hopefully a better understanding of the universe and a more fulfilling way of life.
I have a point to bring up about this group, which was brought to us by electricity, which comes from the Industrial Revolution. We're still using things from the Industrial Revolution. Most of our buildings have metals and things. So I kind of resist that dichotomy that's very popular now. But in terms of this group, we've already had a Haitian professor who talks about the Haitian universe system and his kind of consciousness, which he says is different. He's one of you can get it on our webpage. We also had Hua Li come and talk about Chinese science fiction, and she teaches that at Montana State. We had an Indian woman set up and it was all ready to go, but somehow I lost touch with her. She has written science fiction. And there are also Africans. We are working on getting some Africans. So the old Eurocentric and especially US-centric views are starting to erode. And that's, I think that's a good thing. However, when I tried to get my book together, which was only from Eastern and Western Europe, I was thwarted by Tor and by anybody I worked with or sent my proposal. I had 20 people from 20 countries in Europe, and they said, oh, short fiction never sells. Oh, translated fiction never sells. It's a kiss of death. That's what they told me. And I, on the contrary, despite all these erosions, I think the backlash in science fiction as a field has become, at least where I'm situated, a very nationalistic view. And it has to be our kind of political structure. We don't want to hear it. We don't want to hear about it. We don't want to feature it at our local conventions. Now at the Worldcon, they have all kinds of views and everything is allowed. At our more regional gatherings, it's a very pro-capitalist, pro-US-centric kind of thing. So I think we need to consider that as we're talking about all the technologies. They are poured into a political economic structure as well. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me, Gloria, we were going to talk about the abortion plot in Machinehood and Arizona, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think everything exists in a political context, right? Or a socio-political context for sure. And nothing is homogenous, even within, human opinions, human culture, as we're seeing even in terms of AI today and how it's received. It all depends on who's receiving it and where they're sitting. And yeah, I mean, so for those who haven't read the book, there is a subplot in the story involving someone who wants to get an abortion and is married to someone who's a resident of Arizona, and Arizona has certain laws in this future that thwart her from getting the abortion without the permission of her husband. And it's one of those things where in another discussion group, I had a woman comment that, and this was before Roe versus Wade was overturned. This was back in 2021, I think. And she commented that, she found it kind of disconcerting or disappointing that I, in my future in 2095, would still have these kinds of issues be present around the topic of abortion. And I said, well, from what I've seen, like there's often a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing when it comes to human history and individual liberties and progress, however you choose to define progress. And so I didn't think it was that far-fetched that, especially in certain pockets of the world, that, these things might still exist. And then, yeah, lo and behold, a year later, it's like, oh my God, it got worse faster than any of us thought, right? I'm sure somebody out there was thinking it, so I shouldn't say anyone, but it got worse faster than I thought even. And so, yeah, I think it's gonna be tough. There's gonna be pushback. There's always gonna be reactionaries. There's gonna be conservatives. And I try to espouse that a little bit and have at least a few of those viewpoints come up in the novel. Like Olga's father is obviously a bit more of a conservative and prefers an older way of life. And I think it's valid, right? Everything is valid. To consider the struggles that people have, and everyone kind of has their particular value system. the way of life that they think is right and good. And we're seeing that right now. Interestingly, for me, as I consider myself fairly progressive and left-leaning politically, but watching the progressives and the way they're reacting to a lot of what's happening with language models and AI right now, I feel a little bit like my heart hurts almost, that they are struggling so much with something that I tend to embrace a little bit more easily. So yeah, Gloria, you're.
I had something I was going to ask you. Was this a senior moment? But I think it had to do with our shifting values in some way. Let me just pull it up out of my CRISPR part of my brain. Shifting values, yes.
And then I think Bob has a comment that in the long term, the software in smartphones will be implants in human brains.
Yes.
Yeah, it might be, but does that necessarily make it any more us, right? It's just because it's inside our bodies versus outside our bodies. And I think that's a really interesting question to explore, that does it have to be in our bodies in order to be part of us? Is it not enough that there's a psychological connection with our phones right now and a dependency for most people?
I think I know what I was going to ask. It has something to do with inequality and the global South. But the fact is, I mean, scientifically, and you were talking about progressives because some are very Luddite at this point, very Luddite. And maybe that's a pejorative, but they are. They know that technology is so being driven by capitalism, and they're always against capitalism. So, but one thing that is out there, and it isn't being taken in the way that some of us progressives would take it, is the quantum increase of population. I understand that the ecology folks had to drop that because it would lose them some conservatives on their trying to get a broad base. But when you have that pushing, and yet on the other hand, you can't talk about it, so that what is that called? I'm trying to think of rhetorically what we call that, but I guess it's censorship by self-censorship by omission. And that in science, that's a big factor that we're not talking about, because there is inequality, and the people immediately from the global South say, yeah, you want to have us limit our families. What do you think? Isn't that a big factor in how people are getting more into binary mode and amygdala fight or flight mode?
Yeah, I think that's actually has a lot of analogs to everything else that the amygdala is jumping at when it comes to work, right? And it's sort of that tribalism again, right? That thinking of are you on my team or your team, right? Are you for the environment or against the environment? Like there's no in between, there's no nuance, there's no room for do we have solutions where it can be an and rather than an or, right? Mm-hmm. Can we have nations that have been oppressed and deprived and colonized? Can we give them the opportunity to exploit their resources and to catch up economically and technologically and socially, and be environmentally conscious at the same time? And honestly, I'm looking at India, right, which is a place I pay attention to because I have a lot of family there still. And I think they are starting, at least at some level, to try to put that and into practice. Like I have seen, a lot more push for solar power, for hydropower, right, for clean energy, but also really interesting things like going back, way, way back to methods of farming that long predate industry and mechanization that are actually more eco-friendly ways of channeling water. to where it needs to go for agriculture, for example, or architecturally, you know, building in breezeways, holes in the walls, right? Things to allow airflow that predate air conditioning, or electric fans, right? So human beings have been innovative throughout all of human history that we know of. And we abandoned a lot of that in favor of newer technologies and solutions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they were bad or wrong. And some of them might have things to teach us. Like there was a recent paper where they were trying to figure out how Mayan temple structures and buildings have lasted as long as they have, right? How are they still standing quite well? So we have, and I think is it the Romans who had a form of concrete that that we still haven't entirely chemically figured out how they made it happen. So I think there's this possibility of we can potentially have both, right? That we don't really have to take sides in that way, and it requires reframing the way we think about the conversation.
So when we have all these people and they're dramatically increasing so much on this finite planet, is the solution to go into space? For
in my opinion, no. Space is really hostile. So my latest novel, Meru, and I'm not doing this to plug the novel, but
go ahead.
That was a big question in my mind, right? Was, okay, so do we go and colonize other planets, right? And there's that word again, colonize, to begin with. Are we going to take our exploitation off the Earth to the rest of the universe? Like, is that really the way we want to live, right? Is that the paradigm we want to follow? And in Meru, in this 1,000 years in the future, that have like genetic engineering is like building, a house out of Legos. You can do whatever you want. They have chosen a different path, which is to engineer their bodies to live in the vacuum of space, to not need planets, to not need structures, and to do the least amount of interference or damage to anything in the universe that they can. And so, and a lot of that thinking for me was brought forth by your exact question, right? I used to be very yes, I personally would love to go to space and to go to another planet. And I like to travel and explore. And I'm like, gosh, that would be fun, right? But is it an answer to overcrowding on the Earth? I mean, space is really hostile to human life, to most Earth life, right? There's no oxygen, there's no atmosphere, there's a lot of radiation, it's very cold or very hot. We're not built to withstand space. And in order to adapt space or other planets to us, we have the potential to do a lot of damage along the way, right? We're already trashing low Earth orbitals. So I would hope that that is not the answer. I would hope that the answer is we find better ways of life for people on Earth. And this can be and ways for people to thrive in space, right? That hopefully do less harm than we have, that we learn our lessons. Tardigrades like space, yeah, they do. That was one of my many inspirations. They're testing a bacterial coating on the outside of the ISS that helps block radiation, and those bacteria can survive on the outside. So I'm like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's how they're going to colonize bacteria all over the place. So I have a little thought going way back, speaking of our prehistoric ancestors, to Ray Bradbury. And he has a story. Well, he has many stories dealing with your topics of colonization and why we shouldn't do it and various things. But there's a story called Dark They Were and Goldeneye. And it's from the Martian Chronicles or Medicine for Melancholy. I don't know which one it's in. But it's about a man who can't handle that things are changing and his family are changing because they're adapting and he's not. And I won't, but the family are starting to become Martians. In other words. he's so upset, you know, he's human, and what are you doing? Your eyes look a different color now. So this is one of the hard lines that many people put around them. I am this, and I'm not that. That's a Martian, and I'm a human. I'm better than any Martian. So there's that story. And next month, I think it is, I just want to give you a little forecast. I think it's coming up. I'm looking in my little notebook here. Leah Cypus, I think she's November. Yeah, is going to speak about Blue is Blood, As Blue is Blood. And it's about some sort of crustacean, vaguely things that live on a planet. And this anthropologist family goes out there. And to make a long story short, the little daughter gets very ill. But these are very ahead of us crustacean beings. And they can modify their blood to help her and save her life. So they do. And so this story, As Blue as Blood, is about what happens when she has to go back to Earth, being partly from the crustacean blood. So I hope, you know, this ties in exactly with a lot of things that you're talking about. And it's wonderful how, you know, many things in science fiction, one just ties into another.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are thinking about these kinds of questions. Annalee Newitz's latest book, The Terraformers, just from the title alone, tells you a lot, right? Is absolutely a brilliant exploration of these kinds of questions, and I've seen, yeah, there's quite a bit. I think science fiction has long asked this, you know, what makes us human, and how much can we change ourselves and still be human, and does it matter what we are in order to be people? And so and also I think the terraforming thing and and space colonization is something that a lot of modern authors are rethinking the approach to that being the default, you know, that the galactic empire is what we should aspire to, right? And that should we, you know, let's think about whether that's the right model or we want to go a different way.
Well, those are very good questions. And we are also having someone talk about a film that was it was given very little exposure, called Dark Matter. And it was 2007 with Meryl Streep, and it was about Asian grad students and in an astrophysics department with a Nobel level guy. It isn't per se science fiction, but it goes into this island universes, the Chinese students, and it really tries to connect. This one woman, Meryl Streep, is really trying to connect Chinese culture with the culture of the family she lives in, who are very wealthy, and they go to China and they're buying up China and doing things. So I think it's worth seeing, and you can get it for free on YouTube. And we are going to discuss it in our group next May with Hua Li again and PJ Manny, who works in the Hollywood industry. And so you know, that kind of we don't think of that as being island universes, but that film makes it very clear that even something that we think we all know about Chinese culture, but when you really deal with it, it was a director and a writer who were both Chinese, I believe, but from the mainland, not all assimilated and everything. And it takes it kind of from their view, like the Monkey King, and that opera is brought up, the Chinese opera, the Monkey King, going to the West. It's island universes, but they can connect. And this woman is agonizingly trying to connect with these people. And, you know, that has got to be really a big theme with both difference among humans, but also these beings that are coming in who are not all one or the other, but they are connecting. They're a bridge. Okay, any other questions or thoughts on our speaker and her wonderful presentation? I will go so far as to just pronounce it was wonderful. And I don't know when we've had a speaker who has been able to so field questions from so many different angles, and I think we owe her a round of applause.
Thank you.
Yay. Good for you. And of course, this will go up on our YouTube channel, and I will send you the link so that you can use it for whatever. Oh, my husband Bob says, see if AI has anything it wants to say.
I'm sure AI would add comments if requested.
It has Alexa on at the moment. You can ask Alexa what it thought of this talk.
Well, thank you all for being here and for engaging so wonderfully. This was great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This was
Thank you.
wonderful. Really
And because there was
terrific.
so much, that maybe you'll have something, how that happens, you leave and then, oh, if only I'd asked her. I will forward any other questions if you want to think of something after after this is over.
Yeah, and you can reach me through my website. There's a contact form there. So sbdivya.com, very easy.
Thank
We
you.
wish you all the best. We hope you have a really good career because you're the kind of nuanced thinker and writer that I think could really help the field of science fiction and culture.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
All
Bye.
right.
All right. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
You too.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Bye.